March 27th, 6:31 a.m., 6 days ago, to me 4 attachments scanned by Jamal over Europe in 1940. Survival meant outturning your enemy. Every second counted. One mistake could mean death. But today, the deadliest fighter jet in the world doesn't even turn in a dogfight. It kills before the enemy knows it's there. You're about to see why dogfighting is dead and why World War II tactics would get you destroyed in seconds against an F-35. If you want to see more insane comparisons like Spitfires facing F-35s, you cannot afford to miss what's coming next. Hit that subscribe button right now, because every second you wait, you're missing the story that will completely change how you see air combat. Somewhere over the English Channel, in the summer of 1940, a young man, probably no older than 22, was trying to kill another young man he had never met. He had no radar, no computer, no guided weapon that could find a target 100 miles away. He had his eyes. He had his hands on the stick. He had the machine screaming around him. And he had perhaps 30 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether he went home tonight. This is the story of how humans learned to fight in the sky, and how, over 80 years, the most intimate form of combat ever devised became something almost no one can see. When military aircraft first appeared in the skies above Europe in 1914, no one quite knew what to do with them. They were not weapons. They were eyes. Pilots flew over enemy lines to watch where troops were massing, where artillery was positioned, where the front line had shifted overnight. They came back and reported what they had seen. That was all. But very quickly, pilots on both sides realized something uncomfortable. That man in the aircraft on the other side of no man's land was watching your troops too. And the simplest way to stop him was to shoot him down. First came pistols, fired awkwardly out of open cockpits. Then rifles. Then, as engineers grew bolder, machine guns, fixed to the nose of the aircraft, synchronized to fire through the spinning propeller without destroying it. And just like that, the aircraft became a weapon. A dogfight is defined simply as an aerial battle between fighter aircraft conducted at close range. Close enough to see the other pilot's face, if you were unlucky. The mechanics were brutal in their simplicity. The pilot who could get behind the enemy aircraft almost always won. Most decisive blows came from the rear, from the blind spot, where the enemy could not easily see you and could not easily return fire. So each pilot spent the engagement trying to do one thing: get behind the other man. And the other man was trying to do exactly the same thing. 2 aircraft circling, spiraling, each trying to cut inside the other's turn, to close the angle, to bring the guns to bear. Observers on the ground said it looked like 2 dogs snapping at each other's tails. The name stuck. Dogfighting was not chaos. It was, beneath the adrenaline and the noise, a disciplined science, with principles that pilots memorize the way surgeons memorize anatomy. Because forgetting them, even once, usually meant you did not come home. The principles had been hard-won by the men who died learning them. They were passed down in briefing rooms, written in training manuals, repeated like liturgy. Always keep a sharp lookout. Height gives you the initiative. Always turn and face the attack. Make your decisions promptly. It is better to act quickly even though your tactics are not the best. Never fly straight and level for more than 30 seconds in the combat area. Never fly straight and level for more than 30 seconds. Not 30 minutes. Not 30 hours. 30 seconds. Because a straight, level, predictable aircraft is a target. And the sky, in the summer of 1940, was full of people looking for targets. But the principles went beyond mere survival. There was an offensive philosophy too, an aggression that had to be controlled, channeled, made into something lethal rather than reckless. Initiative, aggression, air discipline, and teamwork. These were words that meant something in air fighting. Going quickly, punch hard, get out. 3 verbs, 3 words. A complete philosophy of combat compressed into a single breath. Notice what is missing from this philosophy: distance, range, safety. The entire approach assumed you would get close. Had to get close. There was simply no other way. If dogfighting was a philosophy, the Supermarine Spitfire was its most perfect expression. It was the only British fighter manufactured before, during, and after the Second World War. It was designed for a single, urgent purpose: to protect Britain from bomber attack. And in the summer of 1940, during the Battle of Britain, it fulfilled that purpose in a way that would make it immortal. Fighter ace J. Johnny Johnson, one of the most decorated RAF pilots of the war, called the Spitfire the best conventional defensive fighter of the entire conflict. That is not a small claim. There were a great many good fighters in that war. Until the introduction of the North American P-51 Mustang, the Spitfire was considered to be the most maneuverable of the Allied fighters, and it was favored by nearly everyone who flew it. Nearly everyone who flew it. That phrase tells you something. There were pilots who found particular aircraft too powerful, or too twitchy, or too demanding. But the Spitfire inspired something approaching reverence from almost all who took it into the air. The Spitfire's elliptical wings were not merely beautiful, though they were that. They were aerodynamically optimal, generating exceptional lift with minimal drag. The stressed skin aluminum structure gave the airframe rigidity without excessive weight. The responsive controls transmitted the pilot's inputs into immediate, precise movement. The aircraft did not fight the pilot. It completed the pilot. A skilled pair of hands on the controls could make the Spitfire do things that seemed to defy the limits of what a machine of steel and aluminum should be able to do. And the cockpit, the small, cramped world where a pilot lived for the duration of a sortie, was where it all came together. 12 Spitfires forming up, climbing east. The watch checked. The scan practiced constantly, left, right, above, below, behind. Always behind. This was not a remote experience. This was intensely, overwhelmingly physical. The G-forces pressed you into your seat as you turned hard. Your vision narrowed at the edges in a high-G maneuver. Your oxygen mask bit into your face. The engine vibrated through the airframe and into your spine. You were not operating a system. You were inhabiting one. And the results? The data tells the story with cold clarity. Spitfire units had a lower attrition rate and a higher victory-to-loss ratio than Hurricanes, most likely due to the Spitfire's higher performance. More of your pilots came home, and more of the enemy did not. But the Spitfire was also more than a war machine. It was a symbol. At a moment when Britain stood alone, when the outcome of the entire war genuinely hung on what happened over the English Channel that summer, the Spitfire gave people something to believe in. News reports from the Battle of Britain made the Spitfire famous not just in Britain, but in America, capturing the imagination of a generation of schoolboys, some of whom would themselves be flying Spitfires by the war's end half a decade later. A machine, yes, but also a promise that skill and courage and the right design could hold back something enormous. For a while, at least, the Spitfire did not stay in Britain. It went everywhere the war went. The Mediterranean, Northern Europe, Italy, North Africa, the Middle East, Malaya, Burma, and the Pacific, theaters whose names map out the full geography of the most destructive conflict in human history. In each of these places, the essential truth of air combat remained the same. You had to get close. You had to see the enemy. You had to outturn him, outclimb him, outthink him, and do it in the time it took for the guns to reach him. The Spitfire adapted throughout. New variants emerged, responding to new threats and new environments. Improved engines, different armament, greater range, higher altitude ceilings. The platform proved remarkably flexible, remaining competitive even as the pace of aircraft development accelerated beyond anything peacetime had produced. The last offensive sorties made by RAF Spitfires were flown over Malaya on the first day of 1951, more than 5 years after the guns fell silent in Europe. By then, the jet age had arrived. Everything was about to change, not just the technology, but the very nature of what air combat meant. The dogfight, as the pilots of 1940 had understood it, was beginning its long decline. The dogfight did not die overnight. It faded the way daylight fades, so gradually that you don't notice until you realize you can no longer see clearly. The technologies that killed it were not invented to kill it. They were invented to win wars. Radar that could detect aircraft from 100 miles away. Infrared sensors that could track the heat of an engine. And above all else, guided missiles. A guided missile changes the fundamental equation of air combat. In a dogfight, you had to be close because your weapons required you to be in a specific position relative to the target. You had to point your entire aircraft at the enemy and hold it there long enough to get a hit. A guided missile does not require this. You fire it. It navigates. The target may be miles away, masked by cloud or distance, completely invisible to the naked eye. And it dies anyway. Longer-range weapons such as beyond visual range missiles have made dogfighting largely obsolete since the early 1990s. Largely obsolete, not entirely gone. Air forces continue to train for close-range combat because warfare is unpredictable and no commander likes to be caught with a gap in their pilot skills. But the primary conversation had moved elsewhere. The question was no longer how to get behind the enemy. The question was how to ensure the enemy never knew you were there until it was too late. By the end of the Cold War, dogfighting had been in steady decline for decades. The iconic image, two aircraft circling each other, pilot against pilot, instinct against instinct, had become, in a real sense, a historical image. Still practiced, still trained for, but no longer the center of gravity around which air combat doctrine revolved. Something had been lost. Something real and human and irreplaceable. But what came next was extraordinary in its own way. To understand what modern air combat has become, you have to understand a concept that barely existed as a formal idea when the Spitfire was flying. Situational awareness. Situational awareness. The accurate perception of what is happening in the environment and what it means has long been recognized as a decisive factor in air combat. The best World War II pilots had it. They called it keeping your head on a swivel. They practiced it constantly. They stayed alive, partly because they saw threats before threats saw them. But a human being, however skilled and however diligent, can only perceive so much. You can scan left and right. You can check your mirrors. You can listen for warnings from your wingman. But you cannot see through clouds. You cannot track an aircraft 100 miles away. You cannot simultaneously monitor radar returns and infrared signatures and electronic warfare signals and still have enough cognitive capacity left to actually fly and fight. This is the problem that fifth-generation aircraft like the F-35 Lightning II, were built to solve. The solution has a name: sensor fusion. And while the term sounds technical and dry, what it describes is something almost philosophical in its ambition. In a fourth-generation fighter, the generation before the F-35, a pilot receives information from multiple separate systems simultaneously. Radar data appears on one display. Radar warning receiver information appears somewhere else. Navigation data is elsewhere. Communications elsewhere still. All of this information, arriving on different displays in different formats at different rates, must be integrated by a single human brain under conditions of extreme stress, physical discomfort, and mortal danger. That integration, that mental act of weaving separate data streams into a coherent picture of reality, is one of the most cognitively demanding tasks a human being can be asked to perform. The F-35 does something radical. It does that integration for you. The aircraft's sensor fusion system takes data from radar, infrared sensors, electronic warfare systems, and networked inputs from other aircraft, and it correlates them. It asks, is what my radar sees the same object that my infrared sensor sees? Is this contact behaving like a threat? What is its heading, its speed, its probable intention? And then, having asked those questions and computed answers, It presents the pilot with something clean and actionable, not a scatter of data points, but a track, an identity, a threat assessment. The fusion engine does not simply present a detection to the pilot. It correlates that detection with other sensor inputs to determine whether multiple sensors are seeing the same thing. It compares the detection against known signatures and behaviors to characterize what it might be. It tracks the detection over time to establish patterns and predict future positions. The result is what pilots who have transitioned from fourth-generation to fifth-generation aircraft describe as transformative. And notice that they almost never describe the transformation in terms of speed, or weapons, or stealth. The change they most frequently describe is not speed, stealth, or weapons capability. It is how they see the battle space. How they see the battle space. The aircraft has changed what it means to perceive. The pilot sits in the cockpit, and instead of raw feeds from separate systems, they see the battle space itself, organized, coherent, with threats already located and characterized and tracked. This is not a small shift. This is a fundamental reorganization of the relationship between the pilot and the world outside the aircraft. The F-35 Lightning II is not designed to win a turning fight. This is not a flaw. It is a philosophy. Its core purpose, the organizing principle around which every design decision was made, is to leverage superior stealth, sensor fusion, and electronic warfare to achieve what military planners call first look, first shot, first kill from beyond visual range. See the enemy first. Shoot first. Kill first. Before the enemy knows you are there. Before a dogfight can begin. Before the question of who has the better turning radius ever becomes relevant. This is a complete inversion of the dogfight philosophy. Where the Spitfire pilot's credo was go in quickly, punch hard, get out. The F-35's doctrine could be summarized as, don't go in at all. Reach out and remove the threat before it can threaten you. And yet the F-35 is described as having redefined dogfighting rather than simply abolished it. How? By completely eliminating the need for it. To eliminate the need for dogfighting is a kind of mastery over dogfighting. It is the equivalent of a chess grandmaster whose positional play is so dominant that the tactical complications never arise. Not because they couldn't handle them, but because they controlled the game at a higher level. The F-35's helmet-mounted display is part of this. The fused picture is projected directly onto the pilot's visor, so that tactical information can be seen while looking in any direction. In a legacy aircraft, situational information required heads-down scanning, a moment when your eyes left the sky, when you were, however briefly, blind. In the F-35, that moment does not exist. The information comes to you wherever you look. And there is something else that changes the nature of air combat completely. When multiple F-35s operate together, each aircraft's sensors contribute to a shared picture. One aircraft might detect a contact with radar, while another sees it with infrared sensors from a different angle. Every pilot sees the same comprehensive picture, even though no single aircraft could have generated it alone. Think about what this means in human terms. A Spitfire pilot in 1940 knew only what he could personally see. His wingman knew only what the wingman could see. Communication was limited. Hand signals, radio, the position of another aircraft in your peripheral vision. Each pilot's awareness was bounded by the limits of their own senses. An F-35 pilot in a formation knows what every sensor in the formation can detect. The awareness is collective. The picture is shared. The pilot's senses have been extended not just by their own aircraft systems, but by the systems of every aircraft around them. This is a different kind of intelligence operating in the sky. Still human at the center, still a person making decisions, still a person accepting risk, but augmented in ways that would be unrecognizable to the pilots of 1940. When you change what pilots can see, you change how they must fly. And when you change how they fly, you change what war in the air looks like. Traditional air combat doctrine emphasized formations and maneuvers optimized for mutual support and visual identification. In 1940, you flew close to your wingman because if you lost sight of him, you lost the protection he provided. You flew in formations that let you cover each other's blind spots. But sensor fusion enables what planners call distributed operations. When every pilot in a formation can see everything every other pilot's sensors detect, physical proximity is no longer necessary for mutual awareness. Formations can spread wider. Individual aircraft can operate at distances that would have meant isolation and vulnerability in the Spitfire era, but now mean coverage and redundancy. Mission planning changes. Command structures change. The decision of when and whether to engage can be made at greater range, with more information, and often with more certainty than was ever possible when everything depended on what a pilot could see with their own eyes. And the concept of identification, of answering the critical question, is that aircraft friend or foe has been transformed. In 1940, identification was primarily visual. You flew close enough to read the markings. In modern air combat, identification happens through sensors, through electronic signatures, through behavioral analysis, through network data from other aircraft, ground stations, and even satellites. Air combat has become, in a meaningful sense, a team sport with a very large team, and some of the team members never leave the ground. But not every Air Force flies the F-35. Not every nation has access to fifth-generation technology. And the gap between those who do and those who do not is not a matter of degrees. It is, in the language of military analysis, a persistent asymmetric disadvantage. Low observability, stealth, means the F-35 may be detected far later than it detects the opponent, or not at all. Fused sensors mean the F-35 pilot knows more about the battle space than the fourth-generation opponent. Network data links mean the F-35 is never alone in the information sense, even when physically separated from its formation. Against this, a fourth-generation pilot, however skilled, however brave, however well-trained, is flying a different kind of contest. They are trying to solve the same problem the Spitfire pilots solved. Get in position, identify the threat, engage. But the opponent has already seen them, already knows their heading and speed and altitude, and is already computing a firing solution. The history of aerial combat is full of remarkable pilots overcoming technological disadvantage with skill and courage and ingenuity. It would be wrong to suggest that technology is everything. Human factors have always mattered and always will. But it would be equally wrong to pretend that the gap doesn't exist or that it is small. The dogfight, that intimate, visible, audible human contest, was in some ways a more egalitarian form of warfare. Two skilled pilots in good aircraft had a genuine chance against each other regardless of which side they flew for. Modern air combat does not offer the same kind of equality. Technological advantage, here, is overwhelming. Across 80 years of change, across the shift from guns to missiles, from visual range to sensor range, from individual awareness to networked collective perception, one thing has not changed. There is still a human being in the cockpit. This fact is more significant than it might first appear. Every technology we have described, sensor fusion, helmet-mounted displays, network data links, exists in service of a human decision-maker. The F-35 does not fight. It enables a pilot to fight better, see more clearly, and decide more quickly. The cognitive demands have changed. The Spitfire pilot needed lightning reflexes and the physical endurance to sustain high-G maneuvering combat. The F-35 pilot needs something different. The ability to manage information at speed, to make high-stakes decisions rapidly based on a sensor picture rather than a visual one, to think strategically within a networked formation rather than tactically within a turning fight. Different demands, but both fundamentally human demands, both requiring training, discipline, judgment, and courage. The machine has extended the human, but it has not replaced the human. And there are good reasons, strategic, ethical, and practical, to believe that this will remain true for the foreseeable future. War in the air, however technological it becomes, remains a human enterprise with human consequences. The story of aerial combat from the Spitfire to the F-35 is not a simple story of progress. It is a story of transformation, of what is gained and what is lost when the most intimate form of combat humans have ever devised becomes something distant, networked, and invisible. The dogfight demanded that a pilot be fully present, physically, mentally, emotionally, in the moment of combat. It asked everything of a human being: skill, nerve, judgment, endurance. And in asking everything, it produced something remarkable, a form of warfare in which individual human excellence could matter enormously. Modern air combat asks different things. It asks for mastery of information, for networked thinking, for strategic discipline. It reduces the role of individual physical courage, or rather, it relocates it. The courage is still there, but it operates at greater range, with more data, inside a system designed to ensure the contest is as one-sided as possible before it begins. Victory today is less about being able to turn within an opponent's turn circle and more about denying the opponent the opportunity to get into the fight in the first place. That sentence contains the entire history we have just told. And it asks a question that this film does not presume to answer. When the fight becomes invisible, when warfare moves entirely into the electromagnetic spectrum, when pilots never see the aircraft they destroy, what remains of the human story in the sky? F-35 versus Spitfire.txt displaying F-35 versus Spitfire.txt.